All right, we are on chapter six. Chapter six and chapter seven go kind of hand in hand. So I think I was saying this when we reviewed four and five, but chapter six really has a bulk of your lecture material for the skeletal system. And then chapter seven is more of your lab material for uh, for the skeletal system. So you really won't have much of a recorded lecture on seven. Like I said, that really is covered primarily by your lab practical stuff, and we'll go over some of the lecture relevant things in class. So this is really your last voice lecture for our second unit here. All right, so of course our skeletal system is comprised of our bones, but this is also going to include cartilage, ligaments, and tendons. And so I know we've seen ligaments and tendons already a couple times, but always will remind you of this one. Ligaments are going to connect bone to bone. Tendons are going to connect muscle to bone. So that's the difference in a ligament and a tendon. We can't just use those interchangeably. We always start off with our functions of our system. One of the obvious ones is our body support. Our skeletal system is somewhat like our framework. It provides an attachment point for our muscles. It protects our organs. There's a reason that our brain and our heart are hidden behind bones. They have some extra protection. And even in our abdominal cavity where we don't have bones, we have a lot of layers of muscles and fat for protection. So we always try to protect our organs. Our skeletal system is really protecting our brain and our skull, and then our heart and lungs and diaphragm kind of behind the rib cage. So body movements, I always kind of put a caveat on because if we're truly thinking about contractile moving the body, that's going to be our muscle system. Our skeletal system helps with body movement because it provides an attachment point and joints for those muscles to actually move. We'll talk some about bones storing fat in the yellow bone marrow, as well as mineral storage. We'll talk about calcium specifically with our bones. And then number five is another one that's a little less intuitive, but that's blood cell production. And we'll talk about red bone marrow, which is kind of where all the precursors of our blood cells start. All right, let's talk a little bit about cartilage first. So, if you look up to the upper left, we can see a microscope slide of hyaline cartilage. And if you remember from lab, one of the things we said we always look out for are these little pockets that our chondrocytes live in, and those are called lacunae. So, that's a really good characteristic to look for from a lab perspective. And hyaline cartilage is also known as articular cartilage because it's found covering the ends of our long bones. And so that's the epiphysis of the long bone is the end. We're going to talk about the different parts of our long bone in a couple slides here. So we find this at the ends, and it's also on the epiphyseal plate. So here's the epiphyseal plate in a child. So that's the same thing as the growth plate. And then you'll see once that ossifies further, once we lose more cartilage cells and add bone cells, adult bones have epiphyseal lines. And so we'll also talk about the two different ways that we, in a sense, make bone in the body. And so most of our bones start off originally as a cartilage model. So the cartilage kind of has a framework that looks like the bone, and then we start replacing cartilage with bone. Okay, we talked about this in our tissues chapter already, but let's talk a little more about bone tissue. We said with any of our connective tissues, one of the main things we look at is what is in the extracellular matrix. And so our bone cells are relatively spread out. If you remember again from our lab and tissues chapter, our bone cells, our osteocytes, also live in pockets or lacuna. And so remember our compact bone was that tree trunk kind of view, and we had those little black dots spread out. Those were our osteocytes. So cells are not very close together. There's a lot of bony matrix. And so this bony matrix is going to be 35% collagen and proteoglycans, and then 65% hydroxyapatite. So collagen and proteoglycans are going to give it some flexibility. Collagen we talked about in our cartilage and connective tissue chapter as being our stronger fiber compared to elastin, but it does allow it to be flexible somewhat as well. And then it's really these crystals. If you think of a crystal as hard, you can remember that the hydroxyapatite. Excuse me. And then I think you can remember that it's going to be a majority of these harder crystals because remember our bones are hard. So they're harder than they are flexible. Our bone cells can produce that bone matrix, and then eventually they end up being entrapped or they stay in that lacuna completely surrounded by bone matrix. So we said our middle one right here, our osteocytes, those are our mature bone cells, and they're the ones that can do both jobs. They can break down some of the old, they can put a little bit of new down. We said osteoblasts, blasts build. And so osteoblasts are responsible for putting down a lot of new bone matrix. Osteoclasts, clasts crush are responsible for breaking down old bone matrix. So try to keep those straight. That goes for a lot of our different tissue types. So we've also said that with chondroblasts, chondrocyte, and chondroclast, same thing. So we'll talk about bone repair and remodeling, and we'll bring these cells up again. All right, our osteoblasts. We said blasts build. These are going to be our bone building cells. And so we call the process of forming bone ossification. Ossification. And so once our osteoblasts are kind of done their main job and they mature, they become osteocytes. And so osteoblasts only lay down new bone. We said osteocytes can do a little of each. So now they have the capability of breaking down some old bone as well. And of course, these are going to be located on the bony surface of our growing bones. Of course, if the bone's not growing, we really don't need many osteoblasts. We're going to have osteocytes. Our osteocytes are those mature blasts, and we said they live in their pocket within the bone called a lacunae. These tiny connections between our osteocytes are called canaliculi. So think of them as little canals that are connecting our osteocytes. And so our osteocytes also have this job of acting as a mechanoreceptor. And so our bones respond to stresses. If you were to lay in bed for 30 days and do absolutely nothing, when you got back out, your bones would be a lot weaker because they haven't had any stress on them. So they're going to think that it's fine to start breaking them down more. And so uh, our osteocytes kind of uh, perceive how much stress a particular area or bone is taking from our daily activity. And so if that bone needs more support or if it's getting stressed more, that's going to trigger our osteocytes to remodel or lay more bone down in that area. Obviously, if something happens like a fracture or something more major injury to our bones, that's a little bit different. But this is happening all the time in response to different stresses. So if you're lifting weights, your bones are going to add more. If you do a lot of walking or hiking, your bones are going to tend to add more. This is one of the big reasons why for someone with osteoporosis or osteopenia, which means that their bones are now not as dense as we would like them to be. One of the big things that they recommend is walking and resistance training because those bones need that additional input to kind of stimulate our osteocytes to build new bone. And then our osteoclasts, their job is to break down bone matrix. And of course, we can't just keep it that simple. We call that bone reabsorption. So blasts, when we're building new bone, we said that was ossification. Clasts, as they're crushing this bone matrix, we call that bone reabsorption. And one of the big reasons we do this, besides what we'll talk about a little bit when we're remodeling, is because it's going to help us mobilize calcium and phosphate. So if you remember back in the beginning, we talked about one of the functions um, being storage. And so calcium and phosphate are two of the minerals that we are going to store in bones. And so if blood levels of calcium or phosphate are getting lower, it's going to stimulate our osteoclasts to break down some bone so we can raise those levels and have more calcium and phosphate available. And so again, this is going to be on bone surfaces. And these are going to be those that are undergoing bone reabsorption. So we've got two different types of bone. We have spongy and we have compact. And so it makes sense. Spongy is going to have more space and less bone than our compact bone. You would think, why would we want something? Oops, sorry, guys. Why would we want something that has less bone that's going to be weaker? Well, it might be a little bit compared to compact bone, but it's also very lightweight and it provides some more space to allow for bone marrow and fat and some other tissues that our bones kind of need to have in them as well. Our compact bone was the one that we looked at in lab with the lamellae, the rings. And so it kind of looked like a tree trunk, so there was not much space. We just had those little black lacunae with our osteocytes, and mostly we just saw bone matrix. Of course, that organization makes it very good at providing protection and support. All right, so our spongy bone and our compact bone are organized a bit differently. So you'll see our spongy bone here looks a lot different. You can easily see the space compared to the compact bone. So we almost have like compact bone borders or two plates of compact bone. And then we have a spongy bone sandwich here. So we call the functional unit of spongy bone this organization of spongy bone trabeculae. So this is going to be these interconnecting rods and plates, and it's like a scaffolding. It forms in a sense a frame or a support, but it's got all these spaces where we can put bone marrow or fatty tissue or whatever else we need to sneak into our bone. So bone marrow and blood vessels is a lot of what's going to take up that space. It's covered with an endosteum. So endo always means into the endosteum, which is a single layer of connective tissue. So one thin layer of tissue, and that's mostly going to have osteoblasts. We'll keep a few clasts around in case we need to remodel or break some stuff down. And we say it's oriented along a stress line. So it makes sense. The place that we're going to have the most stress in the bone, we're going to have a trabeculae so that we're not having air or space where we're going to have some stress. All right, so we still have this lamellae word. It still kind of organizes into these rings. So our mature osteocytes are on the interior in their lacunae. We have mostly osteoblasts around the exterior. And so that exterior would be our endosteum. So covered with the endosteum. And then we have a couple of osteoclasts. So this whole structure here is one trabecula. And so we have many trabeculae, that's plural, that make up our spongy bone. Okay, compact bone, a little different. So there's some similarities but differences. And so this is going to be our solid layer and it's going to surround our bones. We saw with our spongy bone, we kind of had a spongy bone sandwich. So our compact bone forms those borders and it also is going to be located in the shaft of the bone, is almost all compact bone. Instead of a trabecula, this time we have an osteon. So again, the rings that they organize in are called lamellae. And this whole like what I call the tree trunk, is our osteon. So that's going to include multiple osteocytes that live in the lacuna. There's going to be a central canal. And so this central canal, I'm sorry, I keep hitting my cursor when I'm trying to show you guys stuff, is lined with the endosteum. So that endosteum is going to line the central canal. Anytime you see that prefix endo, you know it means into. It's almost always going to be the innermost layer. So that's also where our blood vessels and nerves are going to be located. Remember, in spongy bone, we could easily get those through the spaces. Compact bone, not quite as easy. So we need that central canal to provide an access point. It's also connected by perforating canals. So the perforating canals are smaller canals that allow small vessels to get through. So these are the central canals, and then there's perforating canals that are horizontal that are going to be able to connect all of these. So our concentric lamellae, and those again are our rings. We have our osteocytes living in their lacuna, and then our canaliculi, we saw that word a little bit earlier. Remember, those are the small canals that connect each lacunae, and it allows for nutrients and waste to be passed from osteocyte to osteocyte. So one of the big things I want you to remember is no matter what type of bone we're talking about, an osteocyte is a mature bone cell, osteoblasts build, osteoclasts crush. Our functional unit changes when we're talking about compact bone versus spongy bone. In compact bone that we just talked about, our functional unit is an osteon made up of many osteocytes. In our spongy bone, our functional unit is a trabecula. And again, there's going to be multiple osteocytes. So don't get those confused. An osteocyte is just one cell, it's not the functional unit. All right, let's talk about parts of the long bone here. So we'll start with the two epiphyses since we already introduced that a little bit. So there's our proximal epiphysis. In this case, I'm looking at a femur. And so my proximal epiphysis is covered in what type of cartilage? Good hyaline cartilage or articular cartilage. And we also have the epiphyseal plates. So those are the growth plates that are also made up of hyaline cartilage. In the epiphyses, we have spongy bone. And so in this case, it says it's filled with red bone marrow. So that means that that marrow is responsible for helping to produce blood cells. And then remember, we have this compact bone border around our spongy bone. And as we get into the shaft or the diaphysis, that is going to be pretty much all compact bone. And so we get all the way to the interior. So where we called this the central canal was this central canal in each osteon, this really large opening we call the medullary cavity. And so we have two types of bone marrow. So typically for an adult bone, we're going to have red bone marrow in the spongy bone area and then yellow bone marrow in the medullary cavity. Kids have a lot more red bone marrow everywhere because they're still building up their total blood volume. As adults, we need to recycle red blood cells and be able to make new blood cells, but we don't need quite as much. So we find most of our red bone marrow in our flat bones. Some will be tucked in the spongy bone portions of the long bones, but most of our bone marrow then becomes yellow bone marrow. And yellow bone marrow is another way that we store fat. So fat tissue tends to have a yellow look. I know we look at it as white pillows on our microscope, but think red bone marrow, blood cell production, yellow bone marrow, fat, uh, fat storage. Okay, the epiphyseal plate versus line. So we said our epiphyseal plate we call the growth plate, and that is going to be made of hyaline cartilage. And so initially we start with a much wider epiphyseal plate, And as it narrows and ossifies, the bone is growing. And then once it's fully closed or done ossifying, we call it an epiphyseal line. So the epiphyseal line is just the closed version of the epiphyseal plate. So when doctors are looking at the an X-ray for example of a 19-year-old kid, and they say, "Oh yeah, wow, it looks like you still have a little bit of growing to do." They're saying that because they can see there's still space in the epiphyseal plate. If they tell you they think you're as tall as you're going to get, that's because they can tell that or see that you have more of an epiphyseal line and that growth plate has closed. The endosteum was going to be the very inner lining. It's going to line our medullary canal as well as our central canals in our compact bone that we talked about. And then the periosteum, peri is kind of the opposite. It means surrounding or around. That's always going to be the outer layer. So the periosteum is going to surround the entire bone. And our tendons and ligaments actually run right into that periosteum, and in a sense, they merge together, and that makes a super strong connection between our tendons and bones and ligaments and bones. Okay, make sure. Yeah. All right, we're going to talk about ossification. Another word, at least when we're talking about it initially, is osteogenesis, and that just means bone formation. And so, four different ways that we can trigger or four different reasons we see ossification within the body. Number one, during initial development. So, of course, we need ossification to kind of make our bones and skeletal system in the first place. This continues through puberty and into early adulthood. We said our bones are always remodeling. So remember, we said they respond to stresses. If we put stresses on the bone, and stress isn't a negative word in this case, but if we stress our bones, they will respond by laying down new bone. And then, of course, if we have a fracture, then we're going to have to be able to lay down new bone to heal that. I mentioned this very briefly earlier, but we have two different types of bone formation. We have intramembranous ossification. And so this is where we have a connective tissue membrane, intramembranous, which is going to be replaced by bone. And so this only happens with a few types of bones in the body: flat bones, short bones, and irregular bones. And so the main thing we think about this one is with the skull. And so when uh, a baby's skull is forming, initially it's really just membrane surrounding everything. And then we're going to replace that membrane with actual bone tissue. And so think about a baby's skull when they're first born. It's got those soft spots. We call those fontanelles. And part of that reason that they have these soft spots is because of this intramembranous ossification. And so there's still spots where that membrane hasn't fully hardened, and it allows for growth of the brain and skull before we get full sutures and we have an immovable joint there. What we typically talk about more frequently is endochondral ossification, and that's because our long bones are formed this way. So a majority of bones in the body are formed via endochondral ossification. And so this is where we get the hyaline cartilage framework or hyaline cartilage model, and that is then going to be replaced by our bone tissue. And so you'll see that all the blue here is still hyaline cartilage. So initially, this entire long bone or start of a long bone would be almost all cartilage. And then we start at the primary ossification center. So this in the center, the diaphysis is where we begin to ossify the most. And then we also start to ossify the two epiphyses. And so eventually these will continue to grow. This will continue to grow. We'll leave that epiphyseal plate, and then that plate will close further and further, ossify further and further into the epiphyseal line as we reach full maturity. All right, bone remodeling is the ongoing replacement of old bone with new bone tissue. This is a normal activity. It's happening all the time. This is not a response to injury only. This is part of what happens if we get an injury, but this is a normal process. This is happening all the time. And so this is going to be kind of both bone reabsorption by clasts and bone deposition by blasts. And so we release minerals into the blood. We talked about calcium and phosphate when we break down bone. And then we're going to utilize or pull calcium and phosphate back to give our blasts material to build with. And so this goes both ways. So we can, remember, remove or deposit. So an injury, of course, we're going to usually typically need to deposit new bone to fix the injury. Exercise is going to cause more bone to be added typically. A sedentary lifestyle, we said, would be removal of bone. So if you're just laying in bed and you're not using your muscles and bones, then your body's going to assume you don't really need them as much, and it's going to start taking away from them. And then diet can certainly affect kind of how active your blasts and clasts are. And so it actually does alter the shape of the bone based on the stress. So the areas that are the most stressed, that the areas of the bone that take the most load are going to typically have the most bone, the thickest bone. And that's another concept that's definitely a good one to know, or a good time to bring this up. Our bones don't get longer our whole lives. So when they say bones grow forever or bones remodel forever, it's true because our bones are constantly laying down thicker layers or taking some of those some of that bone away. If our long bones just kept getting longer and longer, we'd be walking around 8 feet tall with crazy long arms and fingers and toes. So once that epiphyseal plate closes and becomes the epiphyseal line, the actual lengthening is pretty much done. It's the thickening that's going to continue to happen for quite a period. And then typically as we age, that thickening is then going to start going the opposite direction some. And for some people, it goes the opposite direction a little bit too fast. And that's where we start seeing the diagnoses like osteopenia and osteoporosis. Okay, I'm not going to play this right this second, but we'll look at this in class together. Or if you're following along with your slides, you can open the link to look at that one and see if you can answer these two questions here. So, what type of cells are the red cells? What type of cells are the blue cells? So, save that one for lecture. All right, now we're going to talk about bone repair. So, bone remodeling is happening all the time. Bone repair is what happens in response to injury, and bone remodeling is our last step of bone repair. So, bone remodeling and repair aren't quite interchangeable. So, I'll say that one more time. So, bone remodeling, we said, is normal. That's happening all the time in response to the different stresses we're putting on our bones. Bone repair, we only refer to with an actual fracture. And then bone remodeling is the last step of bone repair. So clearly we have a fracture here. I think no one needs to be a radiologist to diagnose that one. And so in this case, it's our humerus. So it's the upper arm bone. And that's a pretty significant fracture. So, of course, we have blood vessels, we said, that are traveling through the medullary cavity, through the central canals, through the canaliculi. And so we're going to have a lot of bleeding that occurs when that bone breaks. The periosteum itself also has blood vessels, so all of those vessels are going to bleed and form this hematoma, or um, what it really means a blood tumor. But in this case, it's kind of like a clot, and it surrounds this broken area. So it's kind of maintained somewhat by the periosteum. Then we start to get an actual callus formation. And so it's interesting. We talked about endochondral ossification. We do more or less the same process to repair. So we don't add new bone cells immediately. We add fibroblasts and chondroblasts so that we can develop that cartilage model again, as well as so we get the cartilage and fibers added to make this callus. So we break this callus into two layers. The external callus is cartilage and a little bit of bone to kind of try to hold it together in a sense, anchor it. Same thing on this side. Our internal callus is where we're going to have our cartilage and fibers or new fibers that are being laid down. Just like endochondral ossification, we're going to start to ossify this callus. So you're just going to see, you can kind of see the shadow that formed around there. That's your callus. And then you can see our callus is not exactly very pretty. So we need to clean up the work a bit, and that's when bone remodeling is going to occur. So we, in a sense, lay down too much bone in the callus. We make sure we have plenty of material to work with, and then bone remodeling over time is going to help get rid of some of that excess bone. And it also helped clean up some of this dead bone that is located right where the fracture happened. All right, we're not going to talk about phosphate homeostasis, but we will talk about calcium homeostasis. So you guys should definitely know what homeostasis means by now. We've talked about it enough times. So we've talked about temperature, we've talked about pH. We have homeostasis for almost everything. And so calcium we need to keep at a specific level. One, we obviously need it to make more bony tissue, but we also need it for skeletal and cardiac muscle contraction. So it's super important for muscle contraction, and it's also one of the ions we use for neural signaling. And so bones have 99% of the body's calcium. A large majority of the body's calcium is going to be stored in our bones. Our osteoclasts and blasts are going to be the cells that help us control this level. So if blood calcium levels are low, osteoclasts become more active because we need more calcium in the blood. If blood calcium levels are higher, blasts are going to get that calcium out of the blood and put down some more bony tissue. And while they're the cells, they're the ones that actually do the action. They don't decide to do that themselves. That's maintained by our hormones, and so that's what we'll talk about here next. So when blood calcium level is too low, our parathyroid glands will release parathyroid hormone. And so this is going to stimulate the formation and activity of our osteoclasts. So our blood calcium is too low. We need to take calcium from the bone to add to the blood. Kidneys also kind of help with this in response to parathyroid hormone, and they'll produce a substance called calcitriol. Uh, calcitriol is the active version of vitamin D. So we talked about the start of our vitamin D pathway with UV light in the skin, and eventually our kidneys are what actually produce this calcitriol in response or at the end of that pathway. And this will help us increase calcium absorption in the small intestine, and our kidneys won't get rid of as much calcium in our urine. So our clasts are more active. Our intestines, our small intestine specifically, is absorbing more calcium, and our kidney is keeping more of our body's calcium. This is the primary mechanism that we utilize to maintain our blood calcium homeostasis. Typically, when blood calcium starts to get lower, we release parathyroid hormone. When it gets to a good level, we stop releasing parathyroid hormone. We don't necessarily let it get too high. If blood calcium level is too high, this time our thyroid gland, not the parathyroid, thyroid is going to release calcitonin. So I would say we need to tone down the calcium. Calcitonin tones down the calcium. And so this is going to now inhibit our osteoclasts. It doesn't necessarily stimulate our osteoblasts significantly. Our osteoblasts are always doing some of that remodeling, so they'll continue to pull that calcium from the bloodstream, and now we're going to lose less of that from our clasts. And so the overall effect of this is that our blood calcium level will decrease. But this only happens when we are way out of whack. Typically, parathyroid hormone is going to do the job. Okay, last piece here, we talked about negative feedback systems with homeostasis. And so same thing goes when we're talking about blood calcium. So if you like seeing it in this image and chart format, this is another way to look at it. It says the same thing that we just talked about. So we have our set point here. That's the calcium level or the blood calcium level we'd like to maintain. If it goes too low, we're going to release parathyroid. If it gets too high, calcitonin is going to tone the calcium down. So make sure you take a look at this and take a look at where our hormones actually influence. This is a really good summary slide. All right, thank you. And that, like I said, that wraps up our Unit 2 lectures.